Midnight in Oakmont Drive felt like a photograph. Manicured hedges, gated lights, the hush of a neighborhood built on the assumption that danger stayed on the other side of the gate. Then the front door crashed inward and sound exploded. Boots on marble, a shout that cleaved the silence, the wet slap of a body hitting stone. Angela Turner reached for air. The foyer's white marble drank the light and the red the same way a photograph takes color. There was a spreading, slow bloom beneath her temple and another darker seam along her ribs. She had been finishing charts at the kitchen island, a pediatric nurse with a night's work still in her vest pocket. Her hands went to her face and came away trembling with blood. Someone's knee was in her back. Someone was shouting orders she couldn't parse, except for the one word that landed like concrete. Move. William Turner kept his hands where they could be seen. He was a federal appeals judge, whose work most nights looked like a stack of briefs on the living room table. He'd been reading, the pages marked with dog-eared corners and notes in margins, habits built on patience and precision. Now 2 uniforms loomed over him. One of the men barked at him to get down. He folded slowly to his knees because he had learned to move slowly in rooms that judged him back with a different kind of law. He obeyed. Then cold metal clicked at his wrists. Officer Derek Sullivan was the first to enter, and his movements had the swift, practiced cruelty of someone used to authority being affirmed by force. His partner, Officer James Wright, moved with a different cadence. Less swagger, more calculation. The 2 of them had been dispatched to Oakmont Drive on a report that would later be logged as a domestic disturbance. Wrong address, the dispatcher would later say. In the instant, though, there were only the officers and the Turners and the dark house holding its breath. Hands! Now! Sullivan's voice was a command framed as a threat. When Angela tried to push herself up, he shoved her back and cuffed her wrists behind her. The cuff was hard metal on nursing hands. She cried out, low, acute, and a thin sound ran up the staircase. The Turner's daughter, Maya, asleep in her room, unaware. William did not resist being handcuffed. He kept his calm in the way a judge keeps his calm in a courthouse hallway. Careful, authoritative, the product of a life that had taught him that words, ordered and precise, carried weight. He tried to say his name, then his title. The officers didn't hear, or they did, and let it hang, meaningless, between them. Sullivan lashed out. He struck Angela across the face with the flat of his hand. The blow sent her body twisting on the marble as if a string had been pulled. Blood spread into a fan, dark on pale stone. William, watching his wife slump, said something measured and small. My wife. And felt the cuff tighten. His voice was still strong, but now there was a new element to the scene. Humiliation rendered criminal. He had been reduced from being a man of the law to being restrained as a suspect in his own doorway. You're under arrest, Sullivan said, as he hauled William to his feet. He read the script with relish, the words crisp and practiced. Behind him, Wright moved through the room with eyes that catalogued, hands that sifted through drawers, shoulders that carried an officer's confidence in impunity. They were looking for contraband, for a reason to justify force. The call had been wrong, this would matter later, but at midnight the officers believed overtime and procedure could be written with the same pen as aggression. A search of the living room turned up what every household has: a wallet on a side table, keys, a briefcase with a judge's seal. Wright's hand closed on the wallet and flipped it open. For a suspended second, the world narrowed to a rectangle of leather and plastic. Then he found the card and read it aloud. William Turner, Federal? He let out the rest without finishing the formal title, like an afterthought. Appeals Judge. The name folded into the room and altered the air. Sullivan's face shifted. For someone who had spent years defining other people by the shape of their hands and the color of their skin, the sight of a federal identification card was gravity. His jaw tightened. The thing in Wright's hand, a laminated card with a federal emblem, the name and a clipped title, was small and unassuming, but it carried the authority of an institution that had a different reach than a county badge. In the span of a heartbeat, the balance of intimidation that had framed the encounter wobbled. Hold on, William said. His voice was a judge's voice now, not merely a husband's. He did not shout. He did not pull. He reminded the men of his identity, as he might remind a court of precedent. He recited the bare facts: who he was, where he worked, what his duties entailed. He said it measuredly, not to command them to release his wife, but to make sure the actors in the room knew the play they were performing. Sullivan moved as if he could mask the small unease with aggression. He snagged at Angela's head, forcing it to an angle that expressed authority. "Play it out," he muttered. "Do what you gotta do." It was the language of someone whose instinct under threat was to double down. There were a dozen things that could have ended the escalation then. A different officer's restraint, a neighbor's earlier dismissal, a dispatcher who had read and rechecked the address. None of those things happened. Instead, the human momentum of an unjustified raid met the stubborn dignity of a judge who would not beg for respect he had earned in the courts. Outside, someone had seen the flash of the broken door. Marcus Webb, a neighbor who kept odd hours and an old phone in his hand, stepped onto his stoop and started recording. He would describe later that the light from the foyer cast long, obscene fingers into the night. He recorded the uniformed men in the judge's home as one of them, Sullivan, pressed a woman's face into marble. The footage, he would say, felt wrong even as he filmed it. His thumb shook on the screen. "Sir, please!" Angela cried. The sound hit the stairs and ricocheted in trifles. The officers were already carrying momentum over the threshold. Their radio burbled with the banal noise of officers in the field. Somewhere, a dispatcher made note of the address and the report of possible domestic disturbance. If the dispatcher had known the correct street, if they had triangulated a better call, the men who came would have been different. That dispatch error, later logged as misread characters on a screen, was small and bureaucratic. In an instant, it proved to be enormous. Wright's body cam recorded everything. Its lens sat near his chest, blunt and indifferent. The feed would later be called the single most uncontestable document of the night. At the time it merely recorded. They all assumed it did nothing but file away images for routine review. Wright's voice on that camera was clipped and clinical as he narrated their actions. Names, commands, counts. It would later show Angela's body thrashing as Sullivan struck her, the hand that tried to shield her face, the marble that drank her blood and refused to give it back. "Get down!" Sullivan shouted again, and the order folded into a movement that included forcing William to the ground, cuffing him more tightly, slamming him sideways so his shoulder hit the edge of a table. The judge tasted copper. He felt the press of metal on his skin and thought of precedent, of decisions parsing the boundaries of lawful force. Even in the rawness of pain, he catalogued, "This is force beyond necessary." It felt absurd to be making a legal inventory in the foyer, while the air still smelled like the lemon-scented cleaner Angela used. It felt human to want to protect his wife. He could do neither. The first EMT call was made by a neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Patterson, who lived across the street and had come to see what the commotion was at the house 2 doors down. Her voice in the 911 audio was tight. "There's blood on the steps. They're arresting someone," she said. "They're arresting someone," as if she were presenting a possible truth that needed verification. The dispatcher asked the usual follow-ups. Nature of injuries, threats observed. Mrs. Patterson described what she could see: a woman on the floor, an officer on top of her, a man cuffed, a broken door. The operator typed it into the same system and logged a medical response along with the police. In the house, Sullivan's control had a flash of vulnerability. Wright lifted the judge's wallet for a routine search, again, procedure by footfalls, and felt the laminated card there. He held it up, half to the camera and half to the room. He didn't finish in a formal way, but the word judge did not need finishing. When the title landed in air, Sullivan's aggressiveness changed to a narrowing of expression. He took a step back as if stepping on ice. "Federal ID?" Wright asked, as if the question were purely clerical. He read the card aloud with the casualness of someone reciting the time of day. "William Turner, United States Court of Appeals." The name and the institution had weight. It was an instrument. William spoke then, voice steady in the way of someone who had spent decades moving through rooms where every word mattered. He asked for counsel. He asked that the officers explain the basis for the arrest and the search. He did not shout. He did not respond with threats. He invoked his role not as a shield but as a formal marker that should have changed behavior before force began. The words were like a mirror held up in the foyer. They asked the officers to see themselves as agents of law, not of personal prejudice. Sullivan's reaction was not to relent. He was trained to see authority through his own frame. A federal badge altered the public optics, not necessarily the private intent. He moved to disable Wright's recording. Hands pushed the camera toward the lens, fingers seeking the switch. Body cam footage would later show him fumbling, then jamming the camera as if force could make events disappear. "Turn it off," Sullivan hissed. The attempt would later be a critical moment in the narrative. One officer trying to unmake what was being made visible. At the time, it was a reflex. If the truth of the act could be erased at the source, the consequences might stay small. But Marcus Webb's phone was steady in its capture. From his front steps, he'd seen enough to know what was wrong. His video was a different angle, less official than the body cam, more personal. He recorded the officer's hand on Angela's face, the brief flash of the laminated card as Wright read it. He filmed the judge being pushed to the floor with a gentleness of detail that contrasted with the violence. The judge's tie askew, the papers on a coffee table scattered, a child's toy half hidden behind a chair. The footage had the accidental intimacy of a neighbor's vantage. It would become, in the days ahead, a crucial piece of public evidence. "Stop!" someone cried in the recording. It could have been the neighbor, or it could have been a neighbor's wife. There were 4 or 5 on their stoops now, drawn by light and sound. The phrase "wrong house" began to circulate in low voices. A caller later testified that the officers were told the address again while in earshot. Whether they heard it in that moment was debated later. But at midnight, there were too many things happening at once for clarity to arrive. Paramedics arrived with a measured rush. The EMTs moved toward Angela with practiced urgency, assessing the airway, the breathing, cushioning her head as they found facial fractures and shallow respirations. They called for a rush to the trauma center. The judge's cuffs were not cut off immediately. The scene had to be controlled, a balance between a medical emergency and an on-scene arrest. They recorded vitals and called for a stretcher. Angela moaned and tried to keep her hands over the side of her face as if that might hold her together. William protested that his wife needed immediate attention. His voice had the authority of someone used to controlling events through speech, but words could not unbind his wrists. For all his training and decorum, he was a husband first. He tried to make himself into nothing but a protector in his daughter's mind, calm, present, unbroken. Maya upstairs slept through the noise of boots and radios, the house's ordinary rhythm undisturbed by the extremity below. Sullivan's temper flared at the EMT's insistence that they take Angela quickly. He stood between the paramedics and the front door, as if force could be measured in who moved first. One of the medics, a woman with a level voice and a sheeted calm, told him they were transporting an assault victim. "We have a medical emergency," she said. "Move, please." He stepped aside but kept a hand close to his holster, an unnecessary gesture that would be noted in later reports. Wright's body cam snipped the sound of a radio call. 10:33. Status on scene. He answered with a rundown, the kind of clinical litany that keeps records. 1 female injured, 1 male detained. Potential domestic. Then someone added, "Subject may be federal." The addition into the airwaves made the call a new thing, not merely a local disturbance, but a case that brushed up against another authority. The officers led William out in cuffs. He kept his head high, not because of pride. There was nothing proud in the small way his life had been upended, but because he thought there was at least a chance that being visible as himself might keep the public world honest. People recorded him stepping onto the porch, the camera catching the judge's face as he tried to meet the eyes of neighbors. He mouthed no words at first. The handcuffs slipped and made a soft metallic sound on his wrists, as if punctuation for the evening's chaos. By the time the ambulance pulled away with Angela, the first raw images had already left the house. Marcus Webb uploaded his phone video to a neighborhood group chat, and then to a public platform without much deliberation. What he saw felt urgent in a way that made him reckless. Someone else had called their cousin down the block who posted it further. Within an hour, the clip would have 12 views. Within 2, hundreds. At the time Marcus hit post, He did it because he wanted someone to see what he had seen. A primitive faith that visibility could generate accountability. An internal report would later call the dispatch error a misread alphanumeric string, a clerical mistake with large consequences. The official log would show the wrong address and the wrong occupant profile. The night would be mapped as a sequence of small failures that led to a traumatic collision. In the foyer, however, there was no log, only the sensation of urgency and the smell of blood. There were people to be taken to the hospital, statements to be recorded, and a judge whose badge now sat in someone else's hand. When Wright held the card up and said the judge's name, the house tilted. For the first time, the officer's actions had to reconcile with a system that could hold them accountable beyond the county lines. It did not mean accountability was automatic. It only meant the scene had been reframed in a way that would make disappearing it harder. William's mind cataloged the sequence of events like a man annotating a brief. He thought of precedent. The way cases turned not merely on violence, but on evidence, on who had recorded what and how those recordings were preserved. He thought of the marble under Angela's head and of how ordinary materials could document extraordinary abuses. He thought of his daughter upstairs and prayed silently that the child would understand someday that adults sometimes failed, and that law sometimes had to be relied upon to correct those failures. Sullivan's attempt to silence the body cam failed at first. Wright's device continued to click and record, storing frames in binary silence. Sullivan's hand had banged it, and the camera had wobbled, but the footage remained. He cursed under his breath, a string with a bleeped equivalent that would later be transcribed in cleaner text as expletive. It was the small human moment, an anger that could be heard without needing precise words. The dispatcher logged the call differently as the night crept on, a supervisor's name scrawled into a file. Somebody called internal affairs to report an officer-involved incident at Oakmont Drive. It was a procedural step that implied investigation, but did not guarantee one. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb's video had left his phone and ridden the city's networks into the hands of concerned neighbors and a local reporter who knew how to follow the aroma of a story. William was led away in handcuffs to the squad car, while paramedics loaded Angela into the ambulance. Near the threshold, a small cluster of neighbors watched in shock. A woman put a hand to her mouth. Children in pajamas clutched at their parents' legs and were hurried inside. The house's lamplight threw long shadows that mingled with the blue strobe of the police cruiser. It was an image that looked like something painted. Control and chaos blended into the American tableau. There was a moment when everything seemed to slow. The judge looked at the officers and then at his wife being lifted into the ambulance. He registered, with that peculiar clarity that pain sometimes affords, that the wrong address had been the catalyst. He registered, too, that the laminated card in Wright's hand had the power to change the direction away from erasure toward exposure. Night had made the reveal sharper. If this is speaking to you, a voice in the narrative might say, not as a courtroom admonition but as a quiet invitation, share your experiences with police accountability in the comments. The ask would be small and purposeful. It is how ordinary people start to stitch together a collective attention that can push institutions to answer. For the Turners, the public's attention would become a kind of lifeline. Inside the ambulance, Angela drifted between consciousness and a fog of morphine. Medical personnel stabilized her neck and splinted an arm. They noted facial fractures and possible rib fractures, signs that internal trauma could be present. The EMT's radio called for a trauma bay to be ready. The medics worked fast because their work always belonged to a strict margin of time where choices mattered, and systems could either help or harm. William came to as they processed him into a holding room at the hospital, a place for suspects or persons of interest, a fluorescent space that smelled of antiseptic and waiting. He asked for his phone to call his daughter. He asked that someone tell Maya he was okay. He did not get to speak to her for a while. The cuffs were removed only later when he was escorted for processing. The metal finally traded for clearer visibility in a legal system that was supposed to respond to items of federal interest with a different set of eyes. Sullivan sat in his cruiser and stared at his hands. He flinched at the way the night's events had begun to look back at him through the small electric screens opening onto the city. He thumbed his radio, sending a series of terse messages. He called dispatch to clarify the address. He made a call to the union rep, Marcus Bradley, to say he needed backing. The union, by design and tradition, existed to protect its members, and the words exchanged were part of a larger choreography that would unfold in the days to come. The immediate consolidation of a narrative that could shield officers from accountability, while the victims tried to make sense of their injuries. Back at the Turner's house, a neighbor's phone continued to send clips into the world. Someone bolted the door after the officers left and tried to keep the house as it had been, a domestic space now marked by violence. In the doorway, a scrap of paper lay where a briefcase had been kicked. The laminated federal ID, which had been taken up during the search, had become a pivot. It moved through hands and pockets, and then into a property bag that would later be logged as evidence. That chain would be argued over in the future, who held the card and when. But at midnight it was simply a card, and it made the issue of accountability unavoidable. The first seeds of institutional response were now planted. Not yet the full growth of a federal investigation, but gestures that would become tracks. Someone at the station would write a memo. A supervisor would make a note that a federal officer might need to be notified. The night had opened a fault line between local policing practices and federal oversight. The fault line had been created by a wrong address and made visible by a small official card. William, watching Angela being wheeled away, felt a clarity he had not expected. His legal mind cataloged not just injuries, but evidence. The presence of witnesses, recorded footage, and a federal identification card changed the possibility space. In courtrooms, he had learned that evidence did not lie in abstract. It lay in the story that could be assembled: chain of custody, authenticity, motive. At that moment he began, without words, to assemble the pieces in his head the way he might outline a case. He thought of the body cam, the neighbor's phone, the paramedics' notes. He thought of the small clerical error that had brought officers to his home, and of the larger pattern that the night hinted at. An officer whose default was force, not de-escalation. The local precinct lit up with activity as the first public discourses began to form. A reporter had the rough footage from Marcus and a short statement from a neighbor, a backgrounded account that said, in plain language, what the grainy clip had shown. Officers had used force against a woman and had detained the homeowner, who identified himself as a federal judge. Social media began to stir with the images. The clip found, always quickly, a small but furious audience that wanted answers. Inside, the Turner's life had been split into before and after. Maya, awakened by a knock she couldn't quite place, would remember later the knock of voices and the way her father's wrist had been bound with metal. Angela would recover slowly and painfully. The night had left fractures that would need time to knit. William would think of the irony. A man of the law reduced to a man needing law to protect him from those sworn to protect. It was a reversal that tasted bitter. A constable would later write a report. Officers responded to a domestic call at 12:03 a.m. Upon arrival, officers encountered resistance. The clinical language would make violence sound administrative. But at midnight, for the Turners, the language was not yet bureaucratic. It was two officers in a doorway, the slap of a hand against a face, the small human work of an EMT stitching the edges of injury into stability. As dawn approached, the footage uploaded by the neighbors accumulated into a patchwork of perspectives. Each angle affirmed the other. The body cam feed, crude and relentless, showed a side of events that no press release could easily rewrite. For the first time in the officers' careers, the thought that their actions might be seen not by a closed room, but by thousands of strangers lodged like a stone in their throats. But the stone did not dissolve itself. The next steps would be administrative, procedural, legal, an arc that required more than Instagram outrage. Evidence would need to be preserved. Witnesses would need to be protected. The chain of custody for the body cam, the neighbor's phone, Angela's medical records, all of these would become the scaffolding on which accountability could be built. At midnight, most of that scaffolding was only just starting to be imagined. William leaned back in the hospital chair, wrists inching free, thinking of those scaffolds. He remembered with a kind of judicial exactness the phrase "under color of law," a phrase in legal doctrine that describes when a public official uses the power given by the law to violate someone else's rights. He did not speak the term aloud. He cataloged it mentally because a lawyer's mind does not stop cataloging even when it is bruised. This would not be merely a local grievance. The presence of the federal ID complicated the jurisdictional map. and suggested the possibility of federal civil rights statutes being invoked. The night would not end with simple answers. It would end with pieces of evidence traveling in different directions. The body cam uploaded to the internal server, Marcus Webb's video circulating on social platforms, the paramedic notes filed in a hospital database. The laminated federal ID that had changed the tenor of the event sat in an evidence bag, its small badge visible through clear plastic like an accusation. Sullivan drove home with a radio conversation that played to the hum of the highway. He felt the chill of a new reality at the base of his skull. He had thought, in the unthinking way of some officers, that the night would close with a report that fit the pattern: an arrest, a charge filed, a paper trail of routine. The badge had been an unexpected variable. When an officer encounters a judge, the stakes shift not just because of the judge's position in society, but because the institutions that could inspect the officer's conduct now have easier access to the mechanisms of oversight. At his kitchen table, in the half-light that followed the adrenaline, William thought of what the Turners had to do next: medical care, statements, lawyers. He made a quiet list. He called his clerk to tell her to secure files and to inform his chambers that he would be unavailable. He called Maya's school to say she might need support. He asked the nurse to photograph Angela's wounds and to take a full record. These small acts were the beginning of an archive. But for the moment, at the edge of midnight and dawn, the house on Oakmont Drive was a scene that had been broken open. The wrong address had become the pivot of a larger story. The badge in Wright's hand had become the instrument that made erasure impossible. The videos that circled like small lanterns in the dark would be, in the days to come, the raw materials of a case that would move from private trauma to public scrutiny. People would argue later about motivations, about whether Sullivan's act was isolated or symptomatic, about union protections and internal affairs tendencies. For now, the primary facts were simple and brutal. A nurse assaulted on marble, a federal appeals judge cuffed in his own home, a wrong address call that set all of this in motion, and a laminated card that made the moment more than a private wrong. The rest would be fought in offices, in courtrooms, and in committee rooms. But the night's evidence had been recorded in pixels, in medical charts, and in witnesses' memories. Those documents would keep the story from being only an anecdote. As dawn's gray pushed at the edges of Oakmont Drive, the neighborhood awoke to a new fact: what happens when the person who enforces the law becomes the one who breaks it? The images and voices had already begun to circulate. People on porches compared notes. A local feed replayed Marcus Webb's clip. The body cam footage, though not yet formally released, was known to exist. The sense that this was no ordinary incident took hold. A precinct captain, whose name would later be recorded in a log, made the first call to the district attorney's office to inform them a federal figure was involved. The DA's assistant jotted it down and replied with procedural calm: keep everything intact, preserve video, notify supervising counsel if necessary. It was the language of containment and of procedure. It was also the first small bridge toward a process that might actually hold someone to account. Night had closed a door on ordinary life at the Turners' home. It had also cracked open a window into a public process that would be long and painful. For the Turners, the night would be a prelude to exposure, to investigation, and to a kind of justice that demanded evidence, patience, and public attention. For the officers, the night would shift from being an ordinary watch to an event that would be recorded and parsed. For the neighbors and witnesses, it would be the moment they had to decide whether to speak, to upload, to sign their names to what they had seen. And for the small, laminated federal ID sitting in clear plastic in an evidence bag, it had become, in the cold early hours, more than a piece of identification. It was a turning point. The man whose badge it represented was no longer merely an actor in his own story. He was a pivot that could force an institution to confront itself. By morning, the house on Oakmont Drive had become something more than the site of a wrong address raid. It had become an evidence constellation that would not dim. The federal ID sat in a clear bag with a tamper tape strip, breathless beneath the fluorescence of the property room. The body cam upload spun into the precinct server. Marcus Webb's phone clip had already been copied by a dozen neighbors and forwarded to a local reporter. The clip's timestamp matched the 911 audio in the county dispatch logs. That alignment, times, angles, voices, was the small law of things that makes facts stubborn. Inside the evidence locker, Agent David Carter of the FBI made his first notes. He had been awake all night coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Civil Rights Division. He knew the presence of a federal appellate judge in a doorway changed the map of possible responses. Not because a judge is more important than anyone else, but because the institutional connections that come with that title open lines of federal oversight that local bureaucracy often resists. Carter's job, at that hour, was to make certain that nothing at the scene had a chance to be erased, digital or otherwise. He requested immediate forensic imaging of uniforms and devices, and he pushed for full written chain of custody protocols. The federal interest in the case was no accident now. It was the consequence of the card that had been read aloud in the foyer. By noon, FBI teams were on Oakmont Drive. They worked with a deliberate silence. Lisa Park, the FBI digital forensics specialist, walked through the living room with gloves and a slate of portable drives, cataloging storage devices, body cams, and phones. She photographed the evidence bag that held William Turner's ID and logged every item with a barcode. From a nearby van, Lisa ran a forensic image of Wright's body cam and Marcus Webb's phone. She insisted on mirror imaging, creating exact bit-for-bit copies, so the originals could be preserved and queried later without risk of contamination. "You can't delete what hasn't been overwritten," she told a line of state and local officers who watched, trying to make the language small and usable. She did not lecture them on the ethics of policing. She explained why deleted files are often recoverable. When a file is deleted, the underlying data can remain on a device until it is overwritten. For investigators, that means there is often a narrow window to recover material that someone hoped had vanished. Lisa's work would later produce one of the decisive pieces of the case, a short audio file that had been scrubbed from Sullivan's personal phone but not overwritten, and which contained language that revealed motive in ways that body cam frames could only imply. The local precinct felt the pressure. Captain Robert Hayes sat in an emergency meeting with Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez and Sergeant Michael Davis. Hayes read aloud the initial facts: wrong address, use of force, federal ID discovered, multiple recordings. The words landed hard in a room used to containing messes. Hayes instructed that everything be preserved. Rodriguez called Internal Affairs to initiate the local review. Davis began gathering personnel files. In the hall beyond the command room, Union President Marcus Bradley made calls defending his members. They were doing their job, Bradley told reporters who were already staking out the precinct. He promised due process, a thorough review, and support for the officers. The Union's job, Bradley said, was to ensure officers did not face rush to judgment, language that would become familiar in the weeks ahead. The first defense posture had two tracks: facts and narrative. Daniel Morrison, the defense attorney who would later represent Sullivan, began crafting a public case that framed the encounter as a chaotic domestic call in which officers acted on reasonable suspicion. The Union leaned into procedural language, discretion, split-second decisions, the stress of night shifts. The Turners, by contrast, had the growing force of recorded evidence and the legal heft of one of their own's title. When Lisa Park's analysis returned the recovered audio, the room in the federal task force van went very quiet. The file had been deleted from Sullivan's phone. Someone had tried to excise it. A forensic carve brought it back. The excerpt that prosecutors would later play in court is not reproduced here verbatim, but its effect was stark. In the recovered clip, Sullivan discussed patterns, named groups he felt were different, and described tactics he condoned for dealing with them. Where the recovered audio used explicit epithets in the original file, the public record transcribed the content with bracketed notation, racial slur, to indicate what had been said without repeating it. The prosecution's summary of the audio was stark. The file showed not a single moment of reckless force, but a thread of animus, evidence of intent and pattern that made the use of force not merely a poor split-second decision, but part of a broader practice. That was the pivot. Evidence of motive pushed the night from a potential departmental disciplinary matter into the realm of federal civil rights enforcement. There are two legal rails to explain quickly: 42 U.S.C., Paragraph 1983 is the civil statute that allows individuals to sue state actors for deprivation of constitutional rights. It provides a civil remedy, monetary damages, injunctive relief, when government actors violate federally protected rights. The federal criminal statute that prosecutes deprivation of rights under color of law is 18 U.S.C. paragraph 242. It allows the Department of Justice to pursue criminal charges against officers who, by virtue of their official capacity, willfully deprived someone of rights protected by the Constitution. Both statutes have distinct thresholds. Civil suits under Section 1983 require proof of a rights violation attributable to a state actor. Criminal prosecutions under 18 U.S.C. 242 require proof that the officer acted willfully, an elevated intent standard. The recovered audio was the kind of material prosecutors look for when they must prove willfulness. Federal prosecutors Jennifer Walsh and Michael Cooper convened a charging conference. They reviewed body cam footage, neighbor phone clips, 911 audio, paramedic reports, and Lisa Park's forensic findings. They considered prior complaints against Derek Sullivan, citizen allegations, use of force reports, internal notes. Some of those complaints had been dismissed or minimized in routine ways at the precinct level. But in aggregation, with the newly recovered audio, the pattern took a different color. The prosecutors noted that Sullivan had been the subject of multiple complaints alleging similar behavior. Those prior complaints could be introduced to show pattern and knowledge, subject to legal limitations and rules of evidence that bar character as propensity in many contexts but allow specific evidence of motive or intent. At the same time, the local district attorney's office faced pressure. The DA's office convened with civil rights advocates and the U.S. Attorney's Office to determine jurisdictional coordination. The county's initial inclination to treat the case as a local matter eroded as calls for federal involvement mounted from community groups and editorial boards. The presence of a federal judge, in his own home handcuffed, made it politically and practically untenable to keep the investigation purely local. Public reaction sharpened. The Turner's story, circulating in the small ecologies of neighbor feeds, and then on local television, caught the attention of civil rights groups. Protesters gathered in front of the precinct, holding signs with phrases like, "Accountability now," and "Cameras reveal truth." An ad hoc coalition, community organizers, law students, clergy, organized a candlelight vigil for victims of police violence and a public meeting to strategize ways to maintain attention on the evidence chain. That sustained public scrutiny made certain administrative options less palatable to the county. Decisions to delay, to obscure, to minimize, were now themselves visible. Witnesses faced pressure. Patricia Patterson, the neighbor who had called 911, and Marcus Webb, the man who filmed from his stoop, received anonymous threats, harassing calls, a note left on Patterson's porch, and in one instance, a slashed tire on Marcus Webb's car. The threats were investigated. They were the kind of intimidation tactic that prosecutors would later cite as evidence of the stakes for truth-telling. The union and some internal parties pushed for witness recantation narratives, implying confusion from distance, poor visibility, or misinterpretation. But the multiplicity of angles, body cam, neighbor video, 911, made a clean retraction less plausible. Weeks unfolded with a compressed intensity. The FBI and DOJ filed charges. Federal civil rights violations and conspiracy counts were announced in a public statement. The charging instrument alleged that Officer Derek Sullivan had willfully used excessive force and had conspired with another officer to conceal the conduct. James Wright, Sullivan's partner, was a complication. His body cam showed both action and restraint. His cooperation would become a key decision for prosecutors. He had tried to disable the camera when Sullivan lunged. He had not succeeded. Wright's statements vacillated between loyalty to a partner and the factual record that continued, indelibly, to exist. The county union called the charges politically motivated. Bradley said he feared a rush to judgment and warned against undermining morale in a department that already faced short staffing and long hours. The union's media campaign emphasized split-second decisions and dangerous situations. The defense played the footage in a different narrative frame. Hard decisions in dark places. The county initially considered administrative reassignment for Sullivan rather than termination. That notion evaporated under federal pressure. Prosecutors assembled a courtroom dossier, medical records showing facial fractures and rib trauma for Angela, EMT logs describing possible internal bleeding, and the trauma center's intake notes. The judge's own recorded account of his identity and the events, Marcus Webb's phone video, Wright's body cam, dispatch transcripts, the recovered deleted audio, and prior complaints. Each item was labeled by source and chain of custody. In pre-trial hearings, prosecutors introduced Lisa Park as the witness who had recovered the deleted file and authenticated it. She explained, without grandstanding, the forensic process, imaging the device, preserving metadata, and establishing a mirror copy for legal scrutiny. The judge presiding over the federal case, unconnected to William Turner, would later remark that the technical work of digital forensics was as decisive here as any eyewitness testimony. At every public hearing, the evidence was not merely shown, it was framed. Prosecutors played short excerpts from Wright's body cam to the press. They allowed the neighbor's footage to circulate publicly under court-approved parameters, so the public could see what had transpired without contaminating jury pools later. The defense demanded in-camera review, protean objections flying, hearsay challenges, motions to suppress on the grounds of alleged mishandling, claims that the recovered audio was planted. Prosecutors met those challenges with documentation, preservation logs, digital hashes, verified videos that illustrated continuity. The community did not wait for the wheels of federal justice to complete their course. A city council emergency meeting was called because the public demanded an appearance from local leaders. The council chamber was packed the night the evidence was to be played publicly. Angela was not well enough to attend that meeting. Her lawyer requested a closed session for certain medical details. Maya, worn but resolute, sat in the front row. The microphone would pick up the small sound of her fingers curling the edge of her jacket. At the public hearing, Jennifer Walsh rose and addressed the crowd with the evidence arrayed behind her on screens. "We will not let this be normalized," she said, and then she cued the first clip. The room was hushed as the body cam played. The foyer, the shove, the slap, the laminated card being read. The footage included audio of Sullivan's attempted interference with Wright's camera and the hand that had pressed Angela's face to marble. Then the neighbor's clip followed. The same events from a different angle, showing a hand closing over Angela's mouth. The recovered audio was played for the council in a redacted form. Where Sullivan's language in the file used explicit slurs, the public transcript played an accurate paraphrase, and the audio track was censored on any slurring. The effect was devastating. The combination of recorded images and voice established not just an isolated act, but a pattern and a motive. The chamber's temperature changed. Council members who had previously equivocated heard the audio and, for the first time, discussed immediate policy measures. Independent civilian review boards with subpoena power, mandatory body cam retention policies, automatic notifications to the U.S. Attorney's Office for incidents involving federal officials, and a ban on officers attempting to disable equipment at a scene. The council's recommendations were not law, but they were a local demand for accountability that matched federal pursuit. Then, in a scene that would be replayed in national outlets, federal agents moved at the council session's close. Derek Sullivan, who had come to the meeting to hear public defense from his union and to sit among supporters, was led out of the chamber in handcuffs by FBI agents. Agent David Carter read a short formal statement. Sullivan was under arrest on federal charges relating to deprivation of civil rights and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The arrest took place not in a dark precinct back room, but in public view, in a municipal building, on a night when a community watched proof of harm. The optics were deliberate. An arrest in daylight, with a case of proof displayed, did what off-camera subpoenas could not. It showed that federal enforcement would not be content with private discipline. Sullivan's federal indictment listed counts under 18 U.S.C., paragraph 242, and related conspiracy charges. The defendants were represented in court, Morrison for Sullivan, and the arraignment proceeded with formal readings of charges. Sullivan entered not guilty pleas and was released on restrictive conditions pending trial. The release terms would become a contested public issue. Critics argued for detention given the pattern alleged. while the defense emphasized due process and constitutional presumptions. Pretrial motions were a labor of legal strategy. The defense sought to exclude the recovered audio as fruit of an unlawful search, a motion the government opposed with chain of custody documents and the lab's certification. The court allowed Lisa Park's testimony. She explained that no law enforcement officer had used a warrant to image Sullivan's personal phone. The image had been obtained through lawfully compelled processes in coordination with federal authorities and with proper legal authorization. The judge's rulings left the key evidence in place. The trial itself was a careful choreography of narrative and proof. Prosecutors opened with the image of the foyer, the white marble, Angela's injury, the judge's cuffed wrists, then layered the digital artifacts over it: body cam, neighbor video, dispatch logs, and the recovered audio. They called Angela to testify. She spoke in measured sentences about the night, the pain, and the fear. She answered questions about injuries, facial fractures, rib pain, the fear of internal injury that had sent her to the trauma center. The medical records corroborated her account without delving into gratuitous details. Her testimony was solemn, intentionally restrained. It was the kind of witness account that makes jurors imagine a life suddenly altered. William testified next. He described the events of the evening with the calm cadences of a jurist who understood the weight of words. When asked why he had not resisted, he explained simply that he had attempted to de-escalate through speech, and that in those minutes, he had become both husband and litigant of his own life. His composure was not theatrics. It was a strategic anchor for the prosecution, an insistence that the record mattered. He pointed to the body cam footage and described how he had felt, how an officer's authority had been used not to protect but to dominate. Lisa Park took the stand to authenticate the recovered audio. She explained the forensic mirror, the hash values, the verified chain that preserved the integrity of the file. On cross-examination, Morrison asked about metadata and about the possibility of corruption of files. Park answered with precision. The recovered file bore internal timestamps consistent with other devices, and the carving process left a verifiable footprint. Jurors were shown the waveform and the metadata's narrative. Technical jargon was explained plainly so jurors could see the evidentiary chain without needing a degree in computer science. Wright's body cam footage was played in full during the trial. His image in the frame showed him reaching to turn his partner's arm away from Angela's face, then trying, imperfectly, to stop the escalation. Prosecutors called witnesses to describe prior interactions with Sullivan, ambiguous use of force complaints, patterns of stops in minority neighborhoods that had attracted community concern. Prosecutors used prior complaints not to paint Sullivan as inherently criminal, but to show a pattern of conduct and a departmental failure to remediate problematic behaviors, context that the jury could weigh in light of the audio and footage. Sullivan's defense emphasized split-second decision-making and the stress of fieldwork. They called expert witnesses on police tactics who argued that the context of a domestic call often required force to ensure safety. The defense also sought to humanize Sullivan, showing colleagues who testified to his character in other contexts. But the recovered audio complicated that portrait. Jurors repeatedly returned to the moment when Sullivan's recorded words suggested a policy of targeting. The government's theory, that the conduct was not just negligent or clumsy but willful and motivated, hinged on proving that Sullivan's actions were rooted in bias that translated into fatal force. That is a high bar, and prosecutors had built a case to meet it. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. The evidence had been cumulative: wound documentation, recorded video, neighbor testimony, dispatch logs, and the recovered audio. These pieces formed a narrative mosaic. When the jury returned, the verdict was read aloud in a packed federal courtroom. Guilty on multiple counts, including deprivation of rights under color of law. The verdict did not erase pain. It recorded a public judgment that the state had acted unlawfully through one of its officers. Sentencing, which in federal court is guided by statutory ranges and the federal sentencing guidelines, followed the conviction. The judge considered aggravating and mitigating factors: Sullivan's prior complaints, the gravity of the physical injuries, actions to suppress video at the scene, and the effect on the Turners and the community. The judge imposed a sentence that would be recorded in the public file. The precise number is part of public record in court documents. Dramatization. The courtroom's hush as the gavel fell is reconstructed here for narrative effect. Criminal conviction extended beyond Sullivan. Internal disciplinary hearings led to termination and decertification for duty, while the partner who had failed to stop him faced internal discipline and community censure. The Turners began the long work of recovery in the wake of a verdict that offered a measure of accountability, but not restitution for all harms. Angela underwent reconstructive care and months of therapy for both physical recovery and the psychological trauma of an assault in her own home. She returned to nursing on a limited scale, choosing pediatric shifts that allowed structure and routine. Her public statement after the trial was simple. She wanted better policing, so others would not have to experience what she did. William, whose professional life had already taught him to parse precedent, took a leave from the bench to care for his family and to consult on policy reforms that arose from the case. Maya, teenage, raw, and newly politicized, became a public figure in her own right. She attended community meetings, spoke at vigils, and within a year, testified before a congressional oversight subcommittee alongside civil rights advocates. Her testimony focused on the intimate consequences of public violence, the way a child's sense of safety can be ruptured by an event that happens behind the front door. She did not litigate legal technicalities. She told a human story that legislators could not easily paper over. Her activism helped secure a small but meaningful set of reforms at the county level and influenced federal discussions on policing standards. Policy outcomes followed both pressure and practical recommendations. The county instituted mandatory body cam retention policies. Footage from incidents involving serious uses of force or federal officials would automatically be preserved and transferred to an independent repository pending review. The City Council authorized an independent civilian review board with subpoena power for a pilot period. The police department adopted stricter auditing protocols for internal affairs complaints, requiring third-party audits when patterns of allegations emerged. Training programs were revised to emphasize de-escalation and cultural competency, and the department implemented a new policy forbidding officers from intentionally disabling recording devices at active scenes. Violations would carry severe administrative consequences. These reforms were not panaceas. True structural change requires oversight, funding, cultural shifts, and the political will to act when long-standing norms resist new rules. Some measures were procedural. Others required budgetary commitments and external monitors to ensure compliance. The union fought some of these changes in arbitration, pushing back on what it termed punitive micromanagement. The fight over scope and enforcement continued. Policies were passed, then litigated, and then revisited. But the Turners' case had created an institutional lever that could not easily be put back. There were legal reverberations beyond the immediate case. Civil suits filed under 42 U.S.C. Paragraph 1983 sought damages for the injuries and the violation of constitutional rights. These civil actions allowed the Turners to pursue compensation and to demand institutional reforms via court-ordered injunctions, forcing the county to meet certain oversight standards. Settlements and court orders followed, each accompanied by carefully negotiated language about sustained oversight and independent monitoring. Those civil matters are procedural in nature, but they created additional pressure for concrete changes. Community organizations gained new energy and resources. Local law clinics partnered with civil rights groups to educate residents on preserving evidence, documenting encounters, and filing complaints. The story catalyzed increased public awareness of the importance of body-worn cameras, of preserving footage, and of insisting on independent oversight rather than inward policing. Those shifts had ripple effects across neighboring counties. As policy experiments in Oakmont Drive's precinct were watched closely, there were harder, quieter consequences too. Some officers left the force, others retired early. Internal culture fights persisted. The country's broader debate about policing remained unresolved. One conviction could not redefine nationwide practice. But within Riverside County, the case created a new standard. That recorded evidence matters, that recovered files can be decisive, and that federal accountability is possible when local systems fail. For Sullivan's family, the aftermath was complex. There were sympathizers who decried his treatment and accused prosecutors of overreach. There were also those who had previously filed complaints against him, who felt vindicated. The legal system processed claims, and the court's record became the public ledger on which competing narratives were written. In the quieter hours, the Turners continued their private repair, medical appointments, therapy sessions, nights when the house, once the site of trauma, re-seemed ordinary again. That ordinariness came with a scar. The Turners would always carry the memory of a force used in their own doorway, a wrong address that turned into a life-changing event. Years later, Maya would stand before a committee in Washington and speak about evidence preservation laws. She advocated for specific technical mandates, automatic reporting triggers for incidents involving federal officials, independent preservation orders for body cam footage, and whistleblower protections for officers who refused to cover up misconduct. Her testimony drew on the case's technical lessons, how deleted files could be recovered, how chain of custody mattered, how the public's right to know intersects with privacy and due process. She urged policymakers to move beyond reactionary gestures and toward systematic mechanisms that prevent erasure. The national discussion considered the Turners' case as a study in how accountability can be achieved. Public evidence amplified by neighbors and journalists. Federal intervention when local accountability is structurally compromised. The legal architecture provided by civil and criminal statutes. And the political will brought by an activated public. The narrative did not produce tidy answers. It did, however, demonstrate a path, visibility, preserved evidence, technical expertise, and prosecutorial will. There were, inevitably, questions left open. Could every community expect the same attention if the victim were not a federal judge? What about cases with no bystander footage or no recovered audio? How many innocent nights had been erased because no neighbor had been awake with a phone? Those broader anxieties propelled policy proposals but also underlined the limits of law. No statute can compel a neighbor to film, and not every deletion can be forensically rescued. The Turners' case was as much about contingency as about law. The right items were preserved at the right time. That contingency sparked the policy imperative: create systems where the preservation of truth does not rely on luck. In the years that followed, Riverside County's model, audited body cam retention, a civilian review board, and formal lines for federal notification, was cited in other jurisdictions as an example that could be adapted. The Turners participated in public forums, in trainings for officers who came to learn from the case, and in panels that sought to translate pain into policy. Angela's public remarks were measured and focused on prevention, how to ensure that no other household's marble would become a flood of evidence of harm. The narrative closed then, not with triumphalism, but with tempered hope. The conviction of Derek Sullivan and the institutional reforms that followed did not obliterate systemic problems, but they created a precedent. When the instruments of power are turned against those they are sworn to protect, the law, paired with public attention and technical expertise, can make accountability possible. That was the lesson the Turners insisted upon: agency in the face of an abuse that felt boundless. In the final months of public attention, the Turners met privately with community advocates and policymakers. William, ever the jurist, helped shape a memorandum on policy recommendations. Clear language about evidence retention, about mandatory notification of federal authorities when incidents involve federal officials, and about legal protections for whistleblowers within departments. Angela, whose recovery had been long and painful, spoke instead of healing. How medical care and psychological services must be part of any response to use of force incidents. Maya continued to press for federal oversight measures that would lower the bar for external review in clear-cut cases of misuse. The town remembered the night in small, persistent ways. The patched-up porch light, the neighbor who still nodded when the Turners passed, the local clinic that had expanded trauma resources in response to the case. The city's reforms were not fireworks but slow architecture, changes in record-keeping, audits, and an independent office with staff whose job was to ensure policies were not merely written, but enforced. And the badge that had been read aloud that night, the small laminated card that had made the difference between erasure and exposure, remained in the court's record. An incontrovertible fact that changed the trajectory of a case, and in a small way, the rules that governed an entire precinct. It was a reminder that symbols of authority can do both harm and good. They can be used to intimidate, and they can be used to demand accountability. In the Turner's foyer, a wrong address had collided with a federal ID and created a chain reaction that would not be easily undone. When public attention finally waned, the Turners kept a low profile. They wrote thank you letters to neighbors who had come forward. They attended hearings on policy reforms and sometimes sat in the back row as civil rights advocates presented new data to the council. Their lives, like the case, became an argument about possibility. That recorded truth can produce remedy. That institutional reform is a long-term undertaking, and that communities have a role to play in keeping systems accountable. The last public event tied to the case was quiet in its power. A small plaque was dedicated at a community legal clinic, honoring those who bore witness. Angela attended in a wheelchair, her smile steady. Maya read a short passage about the obligations citizens have to protect one another, including the duty to document wrongdoing and to insist on follow-through. William stood beside his family and looked, finally, at the crowd, without the alert of a courtroom. He spoke softly about evidence, about how facts matter more than noise, and urged citizens to insist on structures that keep footage safe and ensure independent review. Justice in the Turners' case had been imperfect but consequential. The wrong address had revealed a pattern. The badge had made the moment impossible to ignore. That intersection, error, symbol, and evidence, forced a system to reckon. The reforms that followed were not a cure-all, but they were a concrete recalibration of how a county confronts allegations of misconduct. If there is a single operating lesson from the Turner's story, it is this. Accountability is often the product of many small acts: an alert neighbor with a phone, a digital analyst who refuses to let a file go unexamined, a prosecutor willing to pursue a complex case, witnesses who endure harassment for truth-telling, and a community persistent enough to demand better. These elements together can push institutions to change. For viewers watching this unfold, consider how institutions respond when confronted with evidence, and what role community attention plays in making accountability possible. If this story moves you, subscribe for more investigations that examine how truth, technology, and tenacity intersect in the fight for justice. Follow the links in the description to trusted organizations that can help report misconduct and support reforms in policing policy.